And good evening. We're going to share our screen and dive right into our session here. So let me move a few things around to get to where I need to be. All right. So tonight, as I told you last time, we will be focusing on the kind of major wars that occur in the time of the 1863. And when we finished last time, we were talking about how what was happening on the home front and the societal changes. But I told you going in that 63 really functions as kind of a split in the war. There's the pre-63 and then after 63. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation is kind of a key moment for why that happens. But also the war itself transforms. Previously, most of the experiences had been one-off battles. There had kind of been a major battle, and then there was nothing else of any major significance. If you know your 20th century warfare, you know those wars are really 12-month experiences. We all remember D-Day in particular, not D-Day, sorry, the Battle of the Bulge in particular, happening in the cold of December. And you know the war throughout the Eastern Front in World War II, or in Korea as the war with the shifted from just a Korean conflict to the coming of the Chinese in November. Wars in the 19th and earlier century typically didn't fight in the winter, but that begins to change with the Civil War, and you start seeing a large campaigning of like long week after week after week campaigns. And 63 is kind of full of that. So we're kind of at the backdrop of the home front, we're looking at that. But before we do, we actually had some questions for this week. And so I wanted to kind of cover those. And again, thank you for asking questions. Feel free to email me any question. If you have a question while I'm talking, you can, and you're in your house, you can use the chat. If you're there in Stover in the main center, by all means, feel free to write them down to Becca or email her, or she can give you my email. So we talked about the life in the South and how their experiences. So some questions came in about what was happening on the plantations for women. And so the first question, as you can see, is asking, were there actually any attempts by slaves to kind of take over a plantation? And not really. One of the most interesting pieces that does occur to us, which becomes hard for us to really wrap our mind around, is the fact that throughout all of the plantation time period, but particularly here, where you knew there were 20, 40, 60, 80 slaves on a certain place, and there were only a few, owners. Why did they not ever try to rise up? And they did at different times, Nat Turner most famously, but most often they did not. And there were lots of leverage points that the plantation owners had on them, such as obviously physical abuse, the idea of potentially selling a partner, a husband and wife, or their children, which is even more terrifying, away. And so in using some of that sense of leverage on them, in some cases, I think would it be fair to say that there were slaves who didn't know that there was necessarily more out there, and that the fear of being maybe on your own overpowered the sense of, I do better just to stay here, kind of a thing. So even when the men left, there weren't really any attempts, or no that I'm aware of, female plantation owners being murdered. But that didn't change the fact that, particularly as the emancipation happened, and even before that, through 62, and for sure, when the Union Army begins to make an appearance. So you think about in terms of how long would it take without technology for you to find out something was happening? How long would it take for you to find out maybe a part of town burned down if you lived 30 miles away? How long would it take, right? And so if it was 50 miles away, would you ever hear? If it's 15 miles away, you probably would hear. So where's that window of kind of in travel terms, which we in the 21st century, I think we have a hard time really wrapping our head around. But I think as the Army would have gotten within, say, 30 miles of a plantation, you'd begin to have that awareness. And the slaves were not unaware. They weren't like in a data vacuum. So they knew things were happening. They knew the men had left. They all knew a war was happening in some respects. They weren't sure why it was happening or necessarily what was going on with it. The Underground Railroad was still trying to happen. And so some of the leaders, like Harriet Tubman most famously, did participate in both with the military directly and as sort of in a spy status, still trying to operate and getting slaves out. They didn't just sit back and wait for the Army to do their work. And so when the Army got close enough, you'd have slaves abandoning the plantation. But there are many other places in the Confederacy where the Army never gets close to. So like say, for instance, in northwest Louisiana, in southwest Arkansas, much of Texas, much of eastern Mississippi and western Alabama, the Union Army never really goes there, not in any significant form at all. And when the war ends, those plantations are still operating. Slaves have not left. They've not murdered anybody. They've not marched off. If they knew of the Emancipation Proclamation, they didn't have anything more they could possibly do than maybe ask their owner, will you let us go? They had nowhere to go. So that becomes a kind of a key factor in there. And so, you know, with slaves in general, we kind of find this kind of, it's hard for us to get our head wrapped around fully because most of them were illiterate, so that we don't have written records for them. And in many cases, records that we do have would be in hindsight. So somebody who had been a slave in the, say, 1860s, 1850s, recording something in 1880, 1890, which we take, historically, we take that as good primary source data. And at the same time, you and I both know our memory of something that happened 30 years ago, if we had no prior record of it ourselves, you know, it's faulty sometimes. I was asking my mother today, you know, why did my sister like grape things and I like strawberry things? That was 40 years ago. And there's not a good memory of why that was the case, you know, for either my sister, you know, or me. And so we're not saying that the slave recordings that we have in the 1890s and 1900s, excuse me, are inaccurate. We're not saying that. What we are saying is that it's not as strong as had they had something written down. That's why writings by people like Frederick Douglass are so important, because they were much closer to the event. So, you know, I think in general case, we would say the majority of slaves wanted freedom. And so their attitude was one of, I want freedom. And that's why Juneteenth, for instance, is so important, because you're in 65, before the word of the Emancipation Proclamation gets to Texas. So you're 3 years, 2 full years after the event, or 2.5 years before word gets there, that the emancipation had even happened in the Emancipation Proclamation, let alone the 13th Amendment. So, you know, there's this distance of time that played a role in the situation. So for the women, many of them fled. Remember, I showed you that slide last time of refugees. Again, a lot of Americans are unaware that we've had a refugee moment. When we're dealing with refugees today, we shouldn't act like we don't know what that's like. We do, and we've been the takers of refugees most of our time, but in this moment, we were the refugees. And so you have these women and these families deciding they're just going to leave and just flee and just leave the plantation and then deal with it on the other end. And that, of course, raises a whole different issue when you look at the at Reconstruction and kind of what should have happened, what might have happened, and the land becomes a really key part of it. And I won't tiptoe into that today, but most of them left. Again, I don't know of any cases. There might have been a case or two in the time of the war where somebody was murdered. But in general cases, the slaves either stayed on the property, even after the plantation owners had left. Many times the slaves stayed on property, because where else are they going to go? And so if they stayed on property, they could feed themselves, they could provide for themselves, they had housing for themselves, and they could sort of just wait and see what happens. And so that's what they did. All right, so to the war, to the events of the war. Again, in 63, where we kind of found ourselves is the war's is kind of teetering. Now, again, I would tell you that the war's already over, and the Confederacy, if they were smart, would already begin trying to negotiate, because the war's already kind of ended for them, because they failed at Antietam, and in failing at Antietam, they don't get their Battle of Saratoga to convince England to recognize them, and that will be the doom for them. Had England recognized them, there's still no guarantee that we would have lost, the North would have lost, or certainly there's no evidence that Lincoln himself would have negotiated. They kept thinking that somebody will negotiate with us. They'll just let us go. And yet they missed the point that not only in Lincoln, but in probably a majority of the North, no, we don't want to let you go. You're our land and we want to keep you. So that's kind of the plan there. So we kind of see this kind of unfolding this moment. And I really like this day that this topic we're going to cover, because I'm going to do my very best to prove to you why I believe Grant is actually the far superior general to Robert E. Lee. I know that's sacrilegious from a military historian point of view. There are many who will hang their hat on Lee being our best general. He certainly is in our top 5. He's clearly a superior general, but I would argue that if you really study it well, what you see with Lee is that he's often facing inferior opponents, and he does what he should do. He wins against inferior opponents. But I'm going to introduce you to one of the most masterful campaigns by a U.S. general in just a few moments with Grant. And I would contend that Grant actually faced far superior and equal talent. We saw that when he faced Albert Sidney Johnston in Shiloh. We're about to see it now in Mississippi. And I think Grant is a little more successful, actually, than Lee. All right, so here we go. So where we left off last time was after the failure at Fredericksburg in December of '62, Lincoln again looks for another general. This time he places Joe Hooker in charge. I showed you this last time. Hooker was someone who had done well at Antietam and had done fairly well at Fredericksburg, and was seen as somebody who'd be aggressive. Now, you may remember a couple of sessions ago, I showed you a slide that showed that Lincoln understood what was going on here, in which he said, I still haven't found the general who can do the math. Once we have that general, the war will be over. And what Lincoln was getting at is that he, certainly by '62, recognizes the South's not going to just give in. And thus, tragically, the only way you're going to win is through sheer force. And the Union outnumbered, outsupplied, out-industrialized the South easily. Like I told you before, the North's kind of fighting with one hand tied behind its back. It didn't even need to bring the other hand out. We've got people going off on the Homestead Act, and colleges are playing their sports. While in the South, it's, everybody's in, everybody's going for it. So, Lincoln is, if we can just find a general who's willing to do the math, meaning we can go in, we can fight, we can take losses, we'll just replace them. The South will not be able to replace them. And once we go down that road, and this was, again, we compare it to the American Revolution. This was the failure of the British. They could never decide, are we trying to placate, or our friends, or are we trying to crush our enemies? And when you kind of go back and forth on that as a general military strategy, it's not going to be successful. Do one or the other. And Lincoln realizes placating is not going to help. As I was saying before the session started recording, remember, one of the things he was probably thinking with the emancipation is some of the individual states will want to come back into the Union in order to keep slaves, because that was part of the promise. That was the premise behind the Emancipation Proclamation, which is, you remember, freeze no slaves at all, right? So it's a political thing that Lincoln's trying to do there. And none of the states budge. None of them flinch. So now Lincoln's really, okay, look, we're going to have to do this militarily. So he wants Hooker to go into it. Now, Hooker's plan was actually a good plan, and it's actually a successful plan. Hooker theorizes, I'll leave part of my massive army, outnumbered Lee 2-1, near Fredericksburg, which you can see there on the map, and I'll flank him crossing the Rapidan River, or the Rappahannock River, where it splits with the Rapidan, in what's called the wilderness. Now, you guys remember I've told you to go to a lot of the battlefields. This is the one battlefield I've gone to that I would say, don't go to this one. It's impossible to see anything, which is exactly what the problem is. If you've been in the woods, many of you have, I grew up kind of near woods and tromped around in the woods. You know it's easy to get lost. Well, these woods are woods in spades. I mean, it is so thick. And even today, in the early 21st century, if you go there, and they, of course, have the driving tour like they do in all the different battlefields, you can't see anything. All you see is woods because it's that thick. So it's pretty hard to kind of see anything. And what Hooker's plan was to get out of the woods into the open terrain behind Fredericksburg before Lee can flee and then capture him in the middle. It was a great plan, and it actually worked. Lee didn't know where he was. Hooker comes through the woods, and he gets to the very edge of the woods near a little crossroads where there was a tavern built by a man in the early 1800s whose name was Chancellor. And so it gets named Chancellorsville. Don't get confused. There's no town. It's just a crossroads with the tavern. And then he stopped, and Hooker stopped. Lee recognizes, I am in big trouble. And so his strategy is, and this is brilliant on Lee's part, it's risky, but it's all he really had, was to split his army. He theorized that the guys outside of Fredericksburg would not re-attack through Fredericksburg, which had been so devastating in December. And so he's like, okay, I'll leave a few guys there, maybe about 10,000 or so, and I'll march everybody else, and I'll attack. And he does. And the moment he attacks, Hooker freezes. He just sort of freezes, doesn't know kind of what should I do now, and he sort of just sits there in the process. And in the process of freezing, he gives Lee the initiative. Remember, in sports and chess and in life, the initiative is everything. And Hooker freezes. Now, what Hooker said later was that he was trying to set his defenses and kind of dare Lee into a frontal attack so that Lee could experience what had happened at Fredericksburg. Well, Lee wasn't going to fall for it. Not this time. He will in July, but he doesn't here. And so he just watches Hooker pull back. Of course, remember, we're fighting in Virginia. So amongst the Confederate Army, there were people who were from that area. And Stonewall Jackson's chaplain was from that area and had relatives in the area. And they knew that there were ways through the woods, some on deer paths, some on some other lightly used roads, in which they could get around Hooker's army. Now, again, I'm not expecting you to know a lot of military stuff, but if you look at the map, you can see really clearly that on the left side, Hooker's blue line is close to the river. And of course, you can't attack around through the river because you'd have to cross the river a couple of times. So you could say that his line is anchored. It's got a hard boundary, right? That your enemy can't easily get around. But on the other side, where you see the word Howard, there's nothing there. It just sort of stops, and that's just hanging in the air when you think of it from a military point of view. So Jackson says, with his new information, let's flank the flanker. So this guy flanked us, let's return the favor. And because Hooker had given away the initiative, the opportunity was right there. So Jackson proposes and gets permission. In fact, Lee asked him, well, how many troops will I have? And what are we going to do? And Jackson's like, give me all of them. He's like, okay, we'll go with we'll leave you some. But look what he's facing. Hooker at this point probably has 75,000 troops with him in the woods. In front of him, Lee has 15,000. Now, again, not expecting you to know a lot of military, but when you think about it, it's always a mathematical equation, right? So that's like 4-to-1 odds. All Hooker needed to do was start marching forward. There literally would have been nothing Lee could have done. But Hooker is frozen in place. All of his commanders. So if you know Gettysburg, we're going to get there. You see Meade is there, Howard, Sickles. These are all names you'll see at Gettysburg again. They all stay with the army all the way through the end of the war. Most of them are still alive. And they're begging Hooker to attack, and Hooker won't. Remember, he's fighting Joe Hooker, right? But now he won't attack. Now he's kind of like, I'm not sure what I'm doing. And so sure enough, Jackson's able to flank him. Now, luckily for Hooker, they were supposed to, can you see this line right here, this little dotted line right here? That was the road they thought they could go down. But when they got there, about 3 in the afternoon or so, about 2, they realized it wasn't at the full flank because this line of blue was up here. They could have still attacked here, but Jackson wanted to really get them. So he backed up, went further north. He came this way. That cost him about 2 hours. And so they weren't really ready. They weren't even there till 3. And they took them about 2 hours to get unleashed, to get set up. You couldn't just send an army, one brigade in by itself. It wouldn't have worked. He wanted to send everybody in. And of course, what's the part of the tragedy is that the Union Army wasn't blind and deaf. They knew it was happening, and they kept warning Hooker, and Hooker didn't do anything. Now, in Hooker's defense, he had sent word to Howard, hey, prepare your flank, right? But they didn't reposition the army, nor did they attack. Sickles, which we'll see, this is important for coming for Gettysburg, Sickles was like, we need to attack. We need to attack. And they're like, no, we're not going to attack. We're going to wait. So they wait and give all the initiative. And Jackson, of course, pulls it off. He sweeps around the side, shatters the Union flank. And, really only darkness saved the Union Army from complete capture. Go back to this map. Again, if you can see what Jackson would want to do, let me see if I can get my pointer here, is if he can get all the way to the river and back here, can you see this right here, the U.S. Ford? If he gets right to there, of course, Hooker had it defended, but if he gets there, then this army's captured. And that's not just, that's better than killing them. You've got them all captured along with Hooker. That would have been a disaster. So by attacking so late in the afternoon, they're not able to really get this completely surrounded. And so Jackson he's frustrated because he wanted to get there sooner and they're trying to go carefully and the roads were narrow and it's, oh my gosh. So they finally, it's about 7:30, almost 8 o'clock. It's dusk. You know what? It's just like now. It's, getting on closer to 8:30. It's dark. The men are tired. His men have marched like for 5-6 solid hours plus the fighting. So he wants to keep fighting. So he and his officers ride ahead of the line to try to reconnoiter, see if they can find a way in, see if there's another path that they could miss. In doing so, they ran into some Union scouts, some pickets kind of holding the line. They, of course, start shooting, and they don't know what's going on. It's so dark. And Jackson and his guys turn around and ride back. Now, where he's riding back is to his own forces. In the process of riding out, of course, not every soldier was told, hey, General Jackson's in front of us. So they're just minding their own business. And then imagine you're these young men from the South who are there. Some of these are veterans, right? So they're not rookies. And in the process, you're tired and you start hearing gunfire coming at you. So that seems maybe the Union Army is attacking us. You hear hooves coming and it sounds like, oh, I guess it's a cavalry charge. So what would you do? Well, these guys picked up their guns, started shooting back in the dark. And a couple of the guys with Jackson's group are riding forward going, don't shoot, it's the general. But of course, nobody's hearing that. And sure enough, Thomas Jackson, Stonewall Jackson, was wounded and shot in his left arm. And it's amputated. And word gets to Lee, and Lee says, oh my gosh, you lost your left arm, but I've lost my right. It seems like he'll live, but now command's got to be turned over. And again, so think about, we've said Shiloh, we've looked at some of the other battles, they've been one-day battles. Well, this is like day 4, 5, or 6 now. So they still got a moment, and Lee does not want to lose this moment. He's determined to pull this off. So Hooker should have counterattacked in the morning. Remember on the day of Shiloh, the second day, remember we talked about that? And Grant's like, we have to attack first. We cannot allow them to attack first. Well, Hooker doesn't attack when he should have because he still had overwhelming odds. All he had to do was bring Meade down. You can see Meade on the map there. Bring Meade down to attack the flank of what was Jackson's old army, and he would have pushed them back. And if he had just attacked forward, again, Hooker could have gotten his way to out of the woods. And of course, he still has a significant amount of troops over here near Fredericksburg. They've crossed the river. So all they have to do is attack. They outnumber them again, 2-1. Now these guys are uphill, so it's a little bit different. But still, all they got to do is attack. If they would all attack at once, and Hooker won't do it. And so finally, Sedgwick over here in Fredericksburg does attack, which causes Lee to have to pull off. He can't, these guys are coming at him. And so they get all the way over to here, roughly this area. And Lee turns around and has to meet them. When Lee shows up again, the Union Army freezes. And Hooker uses this moment to escape instead of attacking. And again, you're going to pay the attention between that and how Grant handles things. Now, what's interesting is Lee's not happy. Lee realizes this was not a success. If you count by the numbers, the Union Army lost, and it is a defeat. It's most people consider Chancellorsville Lee's finest hour. Fair enough. I still would say at Antietam he was a little bit better than at Chancellorsville, but Chancellorsville was more dicey than Antietam, and he pulls it off. Although again, I think he pulls it off because Hooker fails, just like McClellan failed. In any case, look at the percentages. Right? This goes back to Lincoln's point. The Union Army lost 13%, replaced it immediately. The Confederate Army lost 22, almost 25%, and Lee knows we can't replace these guys. We're already numerically less than them. We're going to be in trouble if we keep doing this. Now, this exact moment is, of course, Grant, we're about to go back to, is making his move in Mississippi. Jefferson Davis, who's from Mississippi, is like, you need to go to Lee. Now, remember, we talked about this last time, the challenge and the failure of a confederated type of government is it's not clear who's in charge. And so here's Davis, the president, saying to one of his best generals, move your army over here. And instead of the general going, yes, sir, Lee's like, no, I don't think so. I'm from Virginia. I can't get there in time. I don't want to. These are Virginians and we're going to fight in Virginia. Although that army Lee had boys from Texas and Alabama and Mississippi and other places. So it's not clear, even though the Chancellorsville's a loss, it's not really a loss. The Union Army, this will be important for Grant when we get Grant in charge throughout 3 weeks or so. The Union Army, they don't feel defeated. In fact, they're mad. They're mad at Hooker for retreating because they felt like they got ripped off by their own commanders who didn't give them a chance to win. And Lee recognizes we're in trouble. And we're in trouble because we can't keep taking these punches, and we're in trouble because of this. Grant is about to pull off the most audacious maneuver by a U.S. general, and certainly to this point, and I've tried to think through it, there certainly MacArthur's invasion in Incheon in South Korea, the Korean conflict. Certainly D-Day is a massively brave moment. Maybe the Doolittle raid is another biggie. Midway was obviously a tremendous gamble in the process, but you'd be hard-pressed to actually place too many campaigns done by a U.S. commander over what Grant does here. So remember, Grant was stuck up here, and he couldn't find a way to get over to the dry ground here. He had given up the central part of the state, kind of ran out by some of the cavalry in early 63. So we come over here. We saw that last time. And so now he's over here going, now what do I do? So finally he decides, you know what? I'm going to cut off my supply line and I'm going to march south. Now, again, got to keep this in mind. There's no McDonald's. There's no Targets to go to. There's no place for him to get food. And we're not talking about him and his family and a couple of people on a road trip. We're talking about 60, 70,000 people. And he decides, which you don't do, that he's going to cut off his supply. Now he knows that if he can get to the south, remember the Union controls the river. So they've already taken New Orleans, Baton Rouge, so he'll get supplies down there. But this move through eastern Louisiana is an incredibly brave move, and most of his generals with him said, don't do it. Lincoln was like, I don't think this is a good idea. Sherman's like, in writing. Sherman made sure he put in writing that I do not agree with this. This is not on me. I didn't make this decision, which is probably one reason why by Grant leaves him up there. He doesn't even bring Sherman down yet. He's got a reason, but still, he's like, you know what? Maybe Sherman's not all that on board. And so he takes off. And the story is, as the boys march, because it was just this long, long march kind of through, dusty roads and bayous. Every so often you come to a bridge and there'd be a dusty man on a dusty horse, and he'd be sitting there going, move up, let's go, boys. And they'd realize that was Grant, that Grant was with them in the moment. And so they pull it off. Admiral Porter makes a very brave run past the guns of Vicksburg, kind of gets really close to the Vicksburg side where they couldn't shoot well, makes it down. And all of a sudden, he's marching down. And on April 30th, long before D-Day of 1945, obviously that was a big deal and had bigger numbers, Grant makes a mile crossing, just like a same sort of amphibious invasion that we'll do in World War II more famously. And you have to understand that when Grant's down here, he only has part of his army, meaning the Confederate generals actually had superiority in numbers at this point. And Pemberton, who's in charge around Vicksburg, is not a bad general. He's not a poor general. He's not a bumbler. He, like Sherman, was just perplexed. Like, what the heck has happened? Where is Grant? And Grant puts in his journal at the time this quote, which I won't read the whole thing to you, but where he's saying, I finally feel like I have taken initiative of this battle because now I am on his side of the river, and I have, even though Vicksburg is between me and my supply base, I'm on dry ground finally. Because remember, they were in that swampy ground on the west side. And he's like, you know what? I'm on dry ground, and we're going to be able to move now and shatter their confidence. And so he does. Grant begins to lay out a plan and puts it into motion. Starts with Sherman, that up in the north. He's going to have Sherman have a fake attack, which is to keep Pemberton looking north while Grant's moving south. At the same time, he decides to go tit for tat with the cavalry. And so he has one of his cavalry guys go on this 600-mile raid through central Mississippi. And about the same time that he's coming down on the south, Grierson is kind of rolling up 50 miles of railroad, which of course will impact communication for Pemberton. Then immediately upon crossing, now Pemberton knows where Grant is and he's thrown off like, oh my gosh, how did he get down there? Grand Gulf, which you can see circled here, had Confederate forces, and Grant decides to loop around them. The Gulf forces, Grand Gulf forces, tried to race back, and this river here is called the Big Black River. Some of you maybe from Mississippi may know this river, and there was one crossing right here. So much like using paratroopers in World War II, where you may know the story of a bridge too far, but the whole idea was we'll land paratroopers and secure the bridges. Grant sent advanced elements racing double time. And we talk about Jackson and his foot soldiers. Well, Grant's soldiers were their equal this day, and they made it to the ferry and captured the bridge, meaning the southern route to Vicksburg was open. So if you're Pemberton, now you're thinking, okay, their army's coming this way. And he begins to make maneuvers to move his army to defend the South. Grant doesn't do it. Grant instead at that moment goes east. He knows that Joe Johnston, who we've met before, remember Johnson was the one that got wounded in the Battle of Seven Pines. So he knows Johnson is now near Jackson and attempting to raise another army. At this point, he only has 5,000 or 6,000 troops. But Johnson tells Jefferson Davis, or Davis tells Johnson, that he should have an army of about 20,000 within a few days coming on the trains and such. So Grant wants to beat him to Jackson, which he does. And so he races to Jackson. Pemberton has no idea at this point where Grant is. And again, remember, Grant is without supply, meaning a supply line that's clear, and he's got equal numbers. And initially, upon the landing in the South, Pemberton outnumbers him. So Pemberton could have rolled everybody out and would have, been in a battle with Grant having superior forces. Now, eventually Grant will bring Sherman down, and Sherman will join the group that's already south, and they will have an equal number. But at no point does Grant have what McClellan or Hooker have, 2 or 3 times his opponent. He's going to get to Jackson. He doesn't battle with Johnson. He just captures Jackson before Johnson can do anything. Johnson actually flees because he realizes, I can't do anything. And then Grant heads, at that point, you see on the map there, he heads to the west towards Vicksburg. He'll fight another couple of battles. Now, one more thing about how amazing this is. Even though when he gets to the southern part, he now has a supply line right on the river through the Navy, he still does not take the typical supply train. So typically when these armies march, you may have seen some pictures in the Civil War pictures that are out there. You'll see, 50, 80, 100, 200, 500 wagons because, an army marches on his stomach, as you probably have heard. And so Grant decides at this moment, after the march south, we're not going to waste time with that. What he doesn't want to give Pemberton is a target. And so he's like, if I have a supply line, they'll have, potentially I'll have to defend it. So these blue lines, don't think about Grant having a supply line. Grant, once again, cuts off his own supply, believing, and again, Sherman and the others are like, what? Nobody had ever done this, not in recent history, meaning in the last maybe 200 or 300 years. Napoleon never did this. Grant's like, we can live off the land. We'll be able to, with our 40, 50,000, to live off the land. Now, your brain should immediately go, wait, isn't that what Sherman does in Atlanta? Yes, which we will see. The march through Georgia, Sherman learned about from Grant right here. Now, obviously, Sherman goes a longer route, but the point is the idea of cutting off your supply and living off the land, Grant shows him right here. Pemberton has nobody to attack except Grant, and he doesn't know where Grant is. So when he does finally battle him here at Champion Hill, it was a nip and tuck battle, actually. Again, equal sizes. It's not a cakewalk for Grant. But Grant's cool and calm in battle allowed him to win that battle. And again, Pemberton just retreats. And all of a sudden, after all of that, Pemberton finds himself stuck in Vicksburg in a siege. Now, before we go to Gettysburg, let me just say, and I tell this to my students every time we get here, if there's ever a war, God forbid, in our country, and there's an army of the enemy coming towards the city you're in, get out. Don't stay. Of all the things war is bad at, and there's a lot of things, and it's horrific, and you don't want to be in one. I don't want to be in one. A siege is the worst. So if there's an enemy army marching on Orlando or marching on the city you live in, particularly if it's a decent sized city, get out, leave everything behind and flee. And they didn't do that, and the citizens of Vicksburg will suffer their worst experiences. And Pemberton can do nothing. By the time they get back in there, Grant's army continues to grow, and there's no relief for the Confederacy. It's this that leads Davis to beg Lee, you've got to go save Vicksburg. Because remember, both Lincoln and Davis were like, Vicksburg's the key. And I told you last time, I'm not really convinced that it's the key, but it was important. We do need to get it for the last piece of the Anaconda plan to be in place. So this takes us then to Lee's moment, right? So Lee's like, what do I do? He, remember the last couple of slides, he's depressed. We won a battle, but did we really win? We didn't really win. England's not coming to help us. That ship has sailed. That Emancipation Proclamation's kind of ruined everything. They're just going to reload with more troops. What can we possibly do? So for Lee, his really last throw of the dice is to once again try to go north with the idea of making the North suffer something of what the South has suffered by war happening on their own lands, and by doing so, influencing the election. You remember, and we've mentioned this a couple times tonight, we looked at both sides' strategies, and we talked about how they kind of mimicked the American Revolution. And then I told you, just like the British and the Americans in 1776, they both failed to see a really critical point of how they could have won sooner, right? And the key for this Confederacy, which was the same key for the American Patriots in 76, was you're not going to win this militarily, not straight up. The way you're going to win is to make it so miserable for the other side. Well, of course, what we just got finished seeing is who's experiencing the misery. It's really the South. And that's playing in, as we saw last week, to the home front. The depression is in both North and South, but the South is feeling it actually worse than the North. So Lee is not really thinking about England. You'll see in some battles like the movie Gettysburg, which is a good one to watch, long, but it's a good one to watch. They keep talking about England, That's misguided. Nobody really who knew anything in 63 was thinking about England. Not Lee, not Davis, not Longstreet. They know it's over, right? So how are they going to pull this off? The only real chance will be to impact the election. Now, the march north is going to be tougher for Lee because when we left Jackson, his arm was amputated, but a lot of people come back from amputation. He could have still been fighting, but a few days after that, he concocted pneumonia from the horrific experience of amputation, which, just you've seen the pictures. It's not a pretty picture, and he dies. And so all of a sudden, whoa, it's not just that our guy lost his shoulder and maybe, that's not good, is that he's dead. And Jackson was a superior battlefield, tactician. So now Lee has got to turn over his army and figure out, how am I going to march north without Jackson? The way he does it, I'm getting a little specific here because it will play into what happens here on day one of Gettysburg, is he replaces Jackson with Richard Ewell. And then the Third Corps now is under A.P. Hill. Longstreet still had his corps. So 3 corps marching north. This is Lee's largest army to march with at all. He basically gathered everybody he could and took off, and he's going to go north. He's not going to waste any time with Maryland. He realizes they are not going to join the Confederacy. So this time he's just zipping all the way to Hagerstown. Remember last time he was trying to get to Hagerstown. This is really the same plan he had before, except he's not going to waste time wandering through Maryland. That's kind of what happened last time. This time it's a straight dash into Pennsylvania. Parts of his army does get to Harrisburg. They don't ever attack Harrisburg. Some of the smaller Pennsylvanian cities are held for ransom. Basically, elements of the Confederate Army showed up and demanded that they pay them money or give them supplies, which they did. In many cases, Lee tried very diligently to not cause too much pain by telling his army and his soldiers, you don't attack people, don't hurt any individual, and pay for what you get. But of course, they're paying for it how? With Confederate dollars, which we saw last time. That's just paper. So there were a lot of bitter people who, were having influence. And it was effective in causing people in this section of Pennsylvania to have some fear. Now, others have proposed, Lee was eventually going to attack D.C. Not a chance. There was no way that Lee was going to attack D.C. In Lee's wildest dreams, what he hoped might happen is that he could destroy the army under Hooker. Hooker's still in charge. And that would force Grant to leave Vicksburg. Now, that is wishful thinking. There is no way, you and I now know Grant well, right? There's no way Grant's given up Vicksburg. You and I know that. I mean, Lee could have actually attacked D.C. and Grant wasn't leaving. But then you also know that Lincoln can pretty much snap his fingers and produce another army of 70, 80, 100,000 people pretty easily. He just needs to put them in place. He's got them all over the North at this point. They might not have been the most trained, but unlike the South, he could just reload. So there's no way Lee was even thinking about D.C. He's thinking about Grant, and what he wants to do is pull the army north. Now, what he assumes will happen, so again, Lee making another mistake here, and he'll make several at Gettysburg. He assumes that the army of the North is not close to him. Now, in Lee's defense, the reason he's able to make this assumption, poor assumption, is that he's lost touch with his cavalry. That's because the cavalry of the Confederacy under Jeb Stuart, J.E.B. Stuart, but everybody just calls him Jeb, had a battle on the very beginning of the campaign, and is one of the largest cavalry-only battles in the Civil War at Brandywine Station. He had been surprised by elements of the Union cavalry. So in that process, he was embarrassed that he had lost troops. And instead of listening and doing what Lee wanted him to do, which was basically, looking at this map here, Lee wants the cavalry just to kind of ride on this side of the mountains and kind of block any chance of the Union army from finding out exactly where Lee is marching. But what Stuart does in kind of a little snit, childish teenager, I'll show you, decides to do is to show off and take his cavalry forces, most of them, and get down here and threaten D.C. And he's not threatening them, he's just showing up, and then ride north. Now, Stuart had assumed that he could come back to his needed position, but he's wrong because Hooker is moving too fast. So Hooker is on the other side of the mountains, but he has his cavalry kind of trailing Lee, and they know where Lee is. So in this case, Lee is unaware how close the Union Army is, and the Union Army knows pretty much where Lee is. Now, they're behind them by several days, but they know where they are, and they're just trailing them. And in their minds, in Hooker's mind, he is between Lee and D.C. So wherever Lee goes, and he's between Lee and Philadelphia. If Lee tries to turn to Philadelphia, Hooker's like, I'm between you, so you can't get there. The worst you can do is burn a bunch of farms in Pennsylvania. So Lee now is marching, as he would say, without his eyes and ears. And this becomes one of the critical issues related to Gettysburg. Now, along the way, the Union Army has its own issues. Again, not surprising, right? The Army of the Potomac and the Lincoln's army there in the East is just a disaster, right? From day one, it's a disaster. So Hooker is unhappy with Lincoln and Halleck, and you remember Halleck is the guy that Grant had problems with. Halleck's now the commander-in-chief of the military. It'd be like in charge of the Joint Chiefs of Staff today. So he's in charge, and they're battling. And so Hooker, again, sort of like Stuart, a little snit, little teenager snit, says, well, I should resign. Here's my resignation. And he wasn't really wanting to resign, but he was just mad. And Lincoln's like, good, got it, you're resigned. And he took his resignation and he just said, okay. And so then he turns it over to George Meade, who's pictured here for you. Meade actually does not want the position. He's like, oh no, I don't think I should be in charge. And some of the other commanders are like, yeah, you shouldn't pick Meade. That's probably a good reason to pick Meade. Remember, for the founders, if you really want to be in power, you're probably not the person who should be in power. So Meade was a good choice. And you can see Lee thought highly of Meade, and he realizes, okay, the game has changed because Hooker was brave, but he also was rash. Now it's like I'm playing a superior chess player, and I'm not going to be able to pull off any stunts. Meade may not be flashy, but he's not going to make any mistakes. But again, for the Union Army, as they're marching just days away from this big battle, clearly there's their own upheaval. So famously, of course, there's this story of shoes. It's in dispute whether or not there actually were shoes in Gettysburg they were coming for. But what's not in dispute is the Confederacy was looking for supplies. They were using this moment to take supplies, not only to have for the army at that moment, but again, as I said earlier, to sort of make the northern people feel the same pain of having your store, your farm raided and had the stuff taken from you and basically getting, nothing back in return. And also having stuff blown up and the impact there, right? So whether they weren't specifically for shoes or not, they were looking for supplies. Now, of course, the Confederate Army is north of the city, and Hooker, now Meade's army, is below them, kind of trailing along. And on June the 30th, some elements of Hill's corps were in Gettysburg, and they saw Union troops. They report this back to their commander, who reports it back to Hill, and Hill's like, that's impossible. There can't be any Union troops here. Because again, in Lee's mind and in all of his commanders' mind, the Union Army is probably 2 weeks away. And again, the plan was, we'll find good ground where we have the superior heights and elevation, and we'll pick our spot. That's what we're going to do. So for the Union Army to be that close was like, wait a minute, who's there? Is it just local militia? So on the morning of the 1st, Hill sends in 2 brigades to go do a reconnaissance in force. Basically, not just a few guys, enough people. And he's assuming nobody will be there, or it'll be just local militia, no big deal, and we'll go on. Lee had said, do not bring on a general engagement, because again, Lee wants to pick the ground. He doesn't want to just be wandering into something. Well, of course, there are people there. Now, because they're there and because it's famous, I want to show you a little bit of the ground. If you know Gettysburg, or the battle, you probably heard of these ridges: Seminary Ridge, Cemetery Ridge. Well, if you ever go, you realize ridge is misleading. It's really just rolling hills. I mean, it's fine they can use the word ridge, but it's, as a boy from East Tennessee, when I hear the word ridge, I'm thinking of some pretty good mountains. And so when you hear they marched up Cemetery Ridge, or they were fighting on Seminary Ridge, you're thinking in terms, or I'm thinking in terms of high elevation. It's not like that at all. I'll come back to this in a moment. This is looking from Cemetery Ridge, where the Union Army is, across the Seminary Ridge. Now, it's not that dark gray in the background. Those are mountains further away. See where the tree line is? See where that's a statue right there. It's actually a big statue, but that's a little statue. That's the ridge that they were on. Now, this is the opposite view, standing in the exact same spot, looking the other direction, because I took these pictures on purpose, right? See where the hill, the house is here, and then see the kind of the top of the ridge. You can see some of the statues over here, some of the monuments that are on this. That's Cemetery Ridge. It's not really much of a ridge, right? I mean, that's the point. I want you to understand. But it is elevated. You would have to march uphill. What's more important is what was on either end of Cemetery Ridge, which was named because the cemetery was at the southern part of town here on Cemetery Hill. And near it was another place called Culp. So these are actual real hills. If you ever go there, it's a little bit of a hike uphill. And at the deep end, or the southern end of Cemetery Ridge, is Little and Big Round Top. So these 2 hills here. And so that's this look. So now I'm in an elevated position, so it's not quite as clear. I'll show you another slide. But you can see, here's the ground level, here's the ground level, here's the ground. It kind of depresses right here, which we'll come back to that in a moment. And then boom, all of a sudden there's a significant hill. And then here's a bigger hill. That's Big Round Top. This is Little Round Top right here, where it's all cleared off, right? So that's what's really going to command the battlefield. On that day of July 1st, the 2 brigades roll in, and sure enough, there's a group of cavalry, and they dismount. Buford's cavalry, very famously, and they fight. And on the north and west side of town, and actually the Union Army was on the Seminary Ridge near the seminary, it's a Lutheran seminary. But because Hill was close by, and then he sends word to Ewell, right? So Ewell's in charge of Jackson's corps, and they're all close by. They quickly overwhelm the cavalry and the few infantry units that are nearby under John Reynolds and Howard. And so they're pushed back through town. And ultimately, by the end of the day, and it's pretty significant, all three days of battle are pretty significant in numbers and in intensity. They all each individually dwarf Bull Run. And remember what we said about Bull Run? It was so shocking to everybody, but like I told you, ultimately, it'd be like a little skirmish compared to what's coming. So they're pushed through town, and they begin to defend around Cemetery and Culp's Hill, which you can see in the map. And this is one of the very famous moments of what happens with Jackson's loss just the month before, or 2 months before, 6 weeks, at Chancellorsville. Lee sends word to Ewell to take the hill, meaning Culp's Hill in particular, if practicable. Interesting way of saying it. Ewell, on the ground there, assesses it. It's late in the day. It's about 7:30. It's kind of dusk, just like we said when Jackson was killed. He's like, yeah, it's not practical. I don't want to fight uphill. They're digging in. We shouldn't waste our time. Other commanders in that brigade, in that corps, were horrified. They're like, we can take the hill. We should take the hill. It's high ground. It's the best place for us. If we take Culp's Hill, then Cemetery Hill becomes a little bit more challenging for the Union Army to hold on to, et cetera, et cetera. Lee never ever wrote down anything more about this. He didn't say whether he was mad at Ewell or what he really thought. But most historians will take the position that Jackson would have understood what Lee was saying was take the freaking hill. But Ewell doesn't hear it that way. And most people believe Jackson would not have even needed the note. He would have just gone and taken it because he would have seen it. I don't know if that's quite fair to Ewell, but you have to, again, remember he's a brand new commander of the famous guy's unit. So he doesn't want to screw up. And attacking uphill, not a good idea. You typically don't do it. So that's what had happened at Fredericksburg. So Ewell probably was thinking, I don't want to be the guy who takes famous Stonewall Jackson's corps and has it get destroyed in this battle because I stupidly attacked uphill. In any case, it is a massively lost moment for the Confederacy in this battle because they don't take the hill. So through the night, all the forces keep coming. Now, they're not all there because they're all in different places, but they all start coming. So on the morning of the 2nd, Lee has assessed the situation as best he can. Remember, no cavalry. He really doesn't know where the Union Army is. And this is his understanding of the battlefield. And so what he believes he can do is have Longstreet move south from where technically Longstreet is probably right up here near Hill on this map. And so he wants Longstreet to move south with his guys. 2 of his divisions are there, McLaws and Hood, and attack the flank. Again, it's always a good thing to do. And that's what he thinks. Now, Longstreet thinks this is a bad idea because even though the ridges are not that impressive to me, and I don't know what you think about it, but it's not that big of a deal, it's still not a good position because you're going to be attacking slightly uphill. And Longstreet's like, look, we don't even know who's here. We don't have our cavalry. They're not nearby. We don't know what's really going on. We need to withdraw. We fought a battle. We can say we won. Let's pull out. Let's go back to the north. Let's go to the west. They have to follow us. If we stay here, we're fighting on not ground we chose. Lee, though, was determined. No, this is the battle. We're going to fight here. We'll make it work. We'll push them off Cemetery Ridge. Then we have the higher ground, and then they'll have to attack us, and it'll be a disaster. Yay! It was a very arrogant and unwise move by Lee to not take Longstreet, because Longstreet's right. On everything Longstreet says, he's right. Now, again, been mentioning kind of childishness. He also decides to be a little childish, and he doesn't really press to march when he was told to march. He was supposed to leave early in the morning because they were going to have to move. It was going to take a couple hours to get every position. And he doesn't really start till midday. And so it's later in the day before they even start moving. So Longstreet kind of plays his hand wrongly. Now, again, here's why they're going down here. Just want you to see it. This is now the direction of where these lower, see these got Hood here? So this is the view Hood would have had when he was at this juncture where the map was showing. So it's definitely important. You can see that's elevated. If you're up on it here, now this is looking towards Cemetery Ridge. Right over here, you see this little white speck? That's a water tower for Gettysburg. So the city's like right here. So this line from this, say this right here, these three heads, moving this direction is where the Union Army was at that point. So clearly, if you get on Little Round Top, you have a firing location in which you can reach the entire line. And it would have been very important for them to pull that off if they could get there. Or now I'm standing down on the same line looking back up. That's Big Round Top right there, that rock crop above this gentleman's hat. That's Little Round Top. But so you can see why they wanted to take it, why Lee is thinking about moving down there, flank them, get those hills, we'll be good. Unfortunately, what Lee thought was this was actually this. Now, back this blue line to here. In other words, there were soldiers all the way down to the Round Top. There weren't really any soldiers on the Round Top because they didn't have a reason to, because the Confederacy was all up here, but they were all the way down to the Round Top. And our good friend Sickles, who we met just a moment ago in Chancellorsville, was in this depression. I'll go back to this map here. See, this map's best. Can you kind of see how the ground kind of falls off where these trees are? It kind of goes downhill. Well, that's where Sickles was. Sickles was in this depressed area, geographically, geologically depressed, lower than the rest of Cemetery Ridge. And he was unhappy. The reason he was unhappy was because he had been on part of that rolling flank that Jackson had attacked 6 weeks before. And in the moment, he had told Hooker, hey, look, we're in a bad spot. And at one moment, Sickles actually had decent ground, high ground at Chancellorsville and was ordered to move. And he did. And he regretted it ever since because the attack by Jackson at Chancellorsville rolled them up. So in Sickles' mind, his commanders are stupid. He's really a New York Tammany Hall politician, but he did okay as a general. He wasn't a terrible commander. But he was like, I'm not taking any more advice from these losers. And they've once again put me in a low spot. And you could see ahead of him was a higher elevated spot. So he's like, we're marching forward, boys. So he starts marching his army forward without any permission. And when he did, it was obviously, bad because you're not supposed to march without orders. Meade sends somebody after him to try to get him. It's like, you can't go out there because we don't know what's out there. And Sickles, ever since, has been just lambasted and attacked by almost every historian you can read about it. And I don't understand that because, and we're almost done for the night, because when Sickles marches out, he discovers Longstreet's movement. Longstreet was actually shielded by those woods. There was no hint that they had, fired. There was no warning. Nobody on Meade's side knew. And if Sickles does not march out there, then Longstreet's forces, though they're later than they should have been, will sure enough roll up both the Round Tops and turn this flank. Because again, Sickles would have been the end of the flank right there. There was nobody on the Round Tops. And by the time the Hood's, this is Hood, by the time his unit rolls in here, they would have had the hills. Sickles marches out. Now it's devastating. He gets destroyed in the peach orchard. They get destroyed in the wheat field. It is a brutal back and forth. Meade sends people out. They all get destroyed. But because it happened, Meade's focus turns from up in Gettysburg down to the south. He starts looking, why are they fighting down there? And all of a sudden he realizes that this battle over here on the hills, right here, this is really a feint. I mean, if they take it, fine, but they're not really thinking they're going to take it. It's all a feint to keep him focused up here while this flank happens. And so Sickles, acting irresponsibly, sure, acting illegal is not the right word, but without orders, yes, but it still, to me, saves the day. Because once he marches out there, he gets involved in the battle. Meade sees it. Meade will send one of his generals, Gouverneur Morris, to go say, what's going on over there? And when they get over there, they'll realize that there's a very heavy amount of Confederate troops marching this direction. They get entrapped in what's called Devil's Den, which is this kind of rocky area to the bottom and to the little bit to the south of Little Round Top. And so it becomes kind of this battlefield where they're shooting. But Morris recognizes, we don't have any troops up here, and they're coming. So he sends word off to find. He finds Strong Vincent from Sykes' division back here in reserve and says, hey, come with me. Vincent basically does the same thing Sickles does, in that he doesn't have direct orders from his commander, but he can tell the word coming from Warren is so intense. He's like, okay. And he races up there to put his troops in what will become one of the most famous battles, moments of Gettysburg, fighting over this hill. Vincent's boys were from New York, and more famously, Joshua Chamberlain's boys were from Maine, and they'll line up starting, if you look here, this is kind of looking towards the round top, the big round top, down where that marker is, all the way through the woods, all the way to this corner right here in this picture. Here's a map. It's a little hard to see, but if you look over here at this spot, see there's Vincent, Strong Vincent's group. And so these boys on these 1, 2, 3, 4, I think those would be brigades, are over here. They're going to hold this line. And famously, Chamberlain was told, you are the last unit of this nearly mile-long line. There's nobody behind you. There's nobody to rescue you. There's nowhere for you to go. You got to hold out. And they will hold out. And we'll stop right there with day 3 coming. At the end of day 2, it looks like this. And now Lee's got a decision to make. And I would suggest that Lee should have listened to Longstreet, but he won't. And it'll be a disaster. And so he'll have, if Chancellorsville is Lee's finest hour in May, it'll be, Gettysburg will be Lee's worst hour, mistake after mistake, other people letting him down like Jeb Stuart. This is where we are on day 3, and we will start right here in 2 weeks. I can't wait to see you guys again. If you have questions, please let me know. I want to always answer any questions you have. I miss our back and forth, but I'm so glad you guys are here with me tonight. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful week, and we'll talk to you soon. I'm going to get out of this share and stop the recording. Thank you so much, everybody.